During the 80s, no one skyrocketed to fame and fortune like Paul Reubens, aka Pee Wee Herman. Starting out in humble beginnings with a theater group, he one day created the Pee Wee Herman persona, and then his career took off. Shortly thereafter, with the help of a few of his acting buddies, he got a show on HBO. Before you knew it, that metamorphosized to TV shows, movies, and even action figures. As the decade ended, he was so successful that he was awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. However, while visiting his parents, a lapse in judgment would cost him all that and more. In one swoop, he was completely ostracized and a laughingstock in Hollywood. What a lot of people don't know is while most people thought afterwards he was laying low from the shame and embarrassment, he was actually dealing with the legal suits for the crimes he committed afterwards. One situation involving an arrest after his home was raided by the police and being caught with the unthinkable. On this episode of Exposed, we examine the life of Paul Reubens, also known as Pee Wee Herman, and the incidents and issues that clearly express who the man truly was. Paul Reubens was born August 27, 1952, in New York. As a young child, he and his family moved to Sarasota, Florida. Reubens developed a love for entertainment at an early age, constantly going to the circus. While attending Sarasota High School, he became president of their theater group. After high school, he attended several schools to study fine arts. He eventually moved to California to pursue opportunities. He eventually joined the improvisational theater group, the Groundlings. Past members include Jimmy Fallon, Conan O'Brien, Phil Hartman, Mariska Hargitay, and Tyra Banks. During this time, members would not just act, but also write scripts together. During an improvisational exercise, members were assigned to develop different characters. Paul came up with the idea of Pee Wee Herman. He borrowed a suit, fixed his hair, and the character was born. Over time, he and Phil Hartman worked on producing comedic material for the character. It then started to take off. In the meantime, Paul tried out for Saturday Night Live several times. On one occasion, it went down to the wire between him and comedian Gilbert Gottfried, and he lost out. He eventually decided to focus his energy on his Pee Wee Herman character. Paul, with the help of his comedic friends, started a show at the Roxy Theater. They performed to sell-out crowds for 5 months. Over time, they developed a following, and Paul started appearing on national talk shows. The Pee Wee character really took off when HBO did a special on him. Noticing Paul's potential, Warner Brothers approached him about developing a script for a Pee Wee movie. Paul, by this time, had already been working on a script that was halfway complete. Also, Pee Wee and the producers saw a film by an unknown, Tim Burton, and hired him to direct. What they produced was Pee Wee's Big Adventure. On a $7 million budget, it grossed over $40 million at the box office. Right afterwards, they developed a sequel called Big Top Pee Wee, but it did not do as well, grossing only $15 million. After the success of the Pee Wee's Big Adventure, Paramount approached Paul about doing a weekly cartoon series for their Saturday morning lineup. Eventually, they came out with the idea of doing a live-action show that would air on CBS called Pee Wee's Playhouse. Some prominent actors who got their start on the show were Jimmy Smits, Phil Hartman, and Lawrence Fishburne. The network originally gave Rubens a $300,000 budget for each show. It was an instant hit. However, while producing the weekly show, Paul also kept doing appearances as Pee Wee on other shows. His goal was to make people think Pee Wee was a real person and not some character. To accomplish this, he never made an appearance as himself and otherwise stayed out of sight. After 5 seasons, CBS wanted to extend the show for several more years, but Paul said no. The long hours were too much for him. He probably also knew that he could still make income when the show went into syndication. Overall, the show ended in 1986 and garnered 15 Emmy Awards, in which Paul received 2. Several years later, Pee Wee Herman would get a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. CBS would continue to run Pee Wee's Playhouse in morning syndication, and despite reruns, it still remained a hit. In 1991, while Paul was visiting his parents in Sarasota, Florida, he decided to go out for the night and went to an adult film theater. As far as using good judgment, it was probably a monumental mistake for him being a public figure. Being from Sarasota, he knew the police at that time were really cracking down on citizens exhibiting lewd behavior and prostitution. It became an issue when some were given citations just for wearing skimpy clothing. However, Paul ignored the warnings that were broadcast. What he didn't know was that cops had planned to raid the adult theater that night for patrons who were acting inappropriately. Over the course of the night, the police arrested 3 violators. As they were about to leave, they noticed Paul in his seat exposing himself. They immediately arrested him as well, and at that point, his life completely changed. His official arrest was performing a lewd act in public. The police officers never recognized him at the station, but a reporter who had been going over the night's arrest records noticed him and broke the story. His arrest was made public, and Hollywood ostracized him completely. When it became national, it got worse. This devastated him financially because his merchandise, such as his dolls and movies, were completely removed from toy stores. Also, Pee Wee's Playhouse, which was in syndication, was abruptly canceled. Paul went into seclusion for several years afterwards, and the Pee Wee Herman character he worked so hard to develop was now a thing of the past. In 1991, he just completed 2 big movies, Blow and Mystery Men. In 2001, while he was on the set of an Elton John video, he got a phone call that the police were at his home with a search warrant. They had a tip that he was in possession of offensive material. The police had been investigating him for a year before taking action. Another actor friend of his had been arrested on a similar charge, and Rubens' name came up. Police had a field day seizing his collections. According to the Los Angeles Times, the police seized over 30,000 images. The police estimate they left another 70,000 behind. Most of it was muscle magazines, computers, and over 2,000 adult videotapes. Rubens was not home at the time. There was so much material to go through that it took over a year for the prosecution to decipher all of it. A day before the statute of limitations expired, they issued a warrant for his arrest and charged him with possession of lewd material involving minors. He pleaded guilty and was placed on probation, forced to pay a fine, and had to register with the police. He also had to seek counseling. Rubens later stated that the raid stemmed from blackmail. By this time, Rubens was 51 years old. His collection, according to him, went back 30 years. What was most surprising was that the incident did not reach the press outside of Los Angeles. A year later, Paul turned himself in on misdemeanor charges for harboring material involving minors. Fortunately for Paul, the prosecution accidentally made a clerical error. They accidentally used a videotape from another case, and Rubens' attorneys were able to prove it. This helped in negotiating the charges against him. In 2004, the case was later dropped altogether when he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. The 1991 arrest was not Paul's first brush with the law. It was just the first time he was prosecuted. In the early 70s, he was arrested for drug possession, but only got a slap on the wrist. In 1983, when his career was just taking off, he was arrested for prowling and loitering by another adult establishment. What was strange was he again never prosecuted for the crime. When he was arrested in 1991 for exposing himself in the theater, he didn't have enough cash to make bail. He called a friend of his who loaned him the money. What's suspicious is that friend was a deputy sheriff with the Sarasota Police Department. When officials found out what she did, she was suspended. She broke policy by doing this because this can be considered a conflict of interest. Coincidentally, that same friend was an intern at the prosecutor's office when Paul was arrested for loitering back in '83. After all this, Paul went into seclusion until the dust settled. Rubens spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do with his career. He continued to write and develop scripts but could not often get the green light to get them going. He once developed a new Pee Wee Herman script wanting actor Johnny Depp to play Pee Wee, with Tim Burton directing. He met with them personally about the project. However, down the line, neither one would ever make a commitment. After his legal troubles, he got small parts in TV shows and movies. He then started writing and creating again. Writing his memoir was somewhat difficult for him because he couldn't decide whether or not to write on his perspective as Pee Wee or as Paul Rubens. In 2016, Rubens released a movie on Netflix called Pee Wee's Big Christmas. It would be the last of the Pee Wee Herman movies. In 2023, his last role would be a small part on the feature film, Quiz Lady. Around 2016, Paul would undergo his most difficult challenge. He was diagnosed with leukemia. While dealing with this, he went into seclusion again and kept it completely to himself. Many of his friends and family were completely oblivious to how bad his health really was. What made things worse is that shortly thereafter, he also developed lung cancer at the same time. He would battle these health problems for the next 6 years. Paul Rubens died July 31st, 2023. He was 70 years old. Officially, his cause of death was due to acute myelogenous, also known as leukemia. In layman's terms, his blood was not getting enough oxygen. In his last days, Rubens made a public statement saying, "Please accept my apology for not going public with what I've been facing the last 6 years. I have always felt a huge amount of love and respect from my friends, fans, and supporters. I have loved you all so much and enjoyed making art for you." As far as his legacy, it seems Paul has been forgiven by the press and public. No one really knew about all his previous incidents and police record. The only logic is all his crimes were victimless. What a lot don't know is that he was socially conscious about his image as Pee Wee Herman. He was a heavy smoker and arranged to keep children from seeing him smoke when he was wearing the suit. He also turned down endorsements for any food that was unhealthy, like candy and sugary edibles. Most who encountered him constantly express how kind he was to others. That is why so many public figures supported him when he went through those legal trials. It seems overall the final verdict is he was immensely talented and driven. Also, he was loved during his life and will be missed.